Investigators seek a serial bomber whose targets crisscross New York State. 4 deadly explosions in 90 minutes leave only vague clues to the bomber's identity. Detectives in Florida rush to the scene of a massive explosion at a lavish estate. Somewhere in the twisted wreckage lie clues that will lead them to the killer. Bomb investigators must piece together the shattered remains of an intricate puzzle. Every long and grueling bombing investigation begins with a short fuse. Eleanor Fowler of West Valley, New York, had no idea the phone call she received a few days after Christmas in 1993 would be a prelude to death. A delivery service asked for directions to her house so they could deliver a package. Suspicious, Eleanor called the police. They told her anonymous packages aren't a crime, and there was nothing they could do. Eleanor accepted the box with reluctance. She cut into it and removed the crumpled newspaper. Inside, she found a toolbox. Whoever sent it didn't include a note. She flipped the latch and lifted the lid, triggering a fatal explosion. Eleanor Fowler was the first victim in what was to become a statewide serial bombing. 5 more bombs, concealed inside identical toolboxes, were delivered throughout northern and western New York within 90 minutes. 4 of the bombs exploded, killing 5 and injuring 2. Investigators from 3 New York offices of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, along with their national response team, followed the trail of explosions to each bomb site. The ATF is the federal agency assigned to investigate bombings. Special Agent Scott Sammis of the Rochester Bureau of the ATF was one of the first agents to respond.
The investigation starts on December 28th, 1993, when I receive a phone call from my supervisor, who tells me to respond to Buffalo. He's had several bombings, possibly several deaths. Please come out there and assist. I'm in Rochester. I'm an hour and a half away. He then calls me back a few minutes later and asks me to stay in Rochester because there's just been a detonation in Rochester with possibly some deaths there.
The 4 simultaneous bombings would stretch the limits of the ATF and other law enforcement agencies. At each scene, investigators' first task was to find every piece of evidence, no matter how small, no matter how inconsequential it looked. It was too soon to tell what might point them to the person who sent the deadly packages. Much of the evidence consisted of small fragments coated with explosive residue. To determine what kind of explosive was used, the evidence at each scene was bagged and sent to forensic chemist Doug Klapek. at the ATF laboratories in Rockville, Maryland.
Well, in this case, we had to make sure that everything not only was stored separately up in Rochester, but was shipped separately down here. And different people were handling different parts of evidence. Even though things were already in airtight containers, we wanted to make sure that was the case.
As the lab processed the evidence, investigators tried to trace the packages. The bomber used local delivery services and the U.S. mail, making the parcels difficult to trace. Unaware of their deadly cargo, the unsuspecting drivers made their rounds. The packages, weighing about 16 pounds, looked harmless enough. How could the delivery people know they were laden with death? Not all the bombs reached their targets. When one driver tried to deliver a package to Corrections Officer Scott Kemp at the New York State Penitentiary, he learned Kemp wasn't working. The penitentiary couldn't accept the package. Aggravated at the delay it would cause him to redeliver it another time, he threw the box into the back of his van. Through sheer luck, the bomb didn't detonate. This bomb and another that malfunctioned were disarmed by the Erie County Sheriff's Bomb Squad. They provided investigators with an important break in the case. They now could look at how the bombs were built.
Inside this device, after it is tripped by opening it up, this would trip the device. Not doing the latch, but opening it up like this would trip the device, like that. That would cause the detonator to explode inside here and hit this about 4 pounds of dynamite. Also included inside of this device was about 11.5 pounds of shrapnel. And these shrapnel pieces were of 28 different varieties.
Propelled by the dynamite, each piece of shrapnel travels 10 times faster than a bullet. Moving at 14 to 15,000 feet per second, the shards can tear through solid concrete. Explosives are grouped in two categories: high explosives and low explosives. High explosives like dynamite and C4 are the most powerful. They are used commercially for demolition and excavation and for military applications. Very stable to work with, high explosives require a great amount of force, a detonator, to set them off. Low explosives include the flash powder used in firecrackers and smokeless powder used in shotgun shells. They're easier to ignite than high explosives and are the explosive of choice for amateur bombers. By looking at the degree of destruction at the New York bomb scenes, investigators knew immediately that it was caused by high explosives. James Crippen, a 9-year veteran with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, trains law enforcement agencies to conduct bomb investigations at the scene and in the lab. He's seen his share of the havoc wrought by high explosives.
Certainly a pound of C4 is going to do a whole lot more damage than a pound of black powder. You know, a pound of black powder, you know, make a pretty good bomb, but, you know, a pound of C4 will, you know, can devastate a building. I mean, you're talking a difference in detonation velocity of anywhere from 1,200 to maybe 1,800 feet per second for black powder to in the neighborhood of 25,000 feet per second for C4. So there's a lot more force involved, a lot more shattering force.
But sometimes people can survive a bomb blast, even from a high explosive. Roosevelt Town resident William Lazore was a target of the New York serial bomber, but his suspicion saved his life. When Lazore picked up his package from the post office, the clerk joked that it might be a bomb. Though the clerk was trying to be funny, Lazor was careful enough to open the toolbox with his rake. That added bit of distance and caution saved his life when the bomb exploded. Several hundred miles away in Cheektowaga, Robert Fowler was less fortunate. Eleanor Fowler's husband received his package at work. These pictures were taken from a surveillance camera that captures a still image every few seconds. They count down the final moments in the lives of Robert Fowler and his co-worker, John O'Donnell. Just before the explosion, another co-worker, Jeffrey Camp, offered to open the package with his pocket knife. The blast was so powerful, it threw Fowler some 15 feet down the hallway. Miraculously, Camp survived and can be seen fleeing the scene for help. 6 bombs, 4 explosions, 4 counties in New York State. Each unexploded bomb was nearly identical, packaged in a toolbox and mailed from Buffalo. The bombings shared another element. All the intended victims were related.
All the family members are interviewed. There were other family members who were not targeted, who were found and interviewed, and who survived. And everyone was asked, who do you think might have done this? And everybody said, well, Mike Stevens, maybe he did it.
56-year-old Mike Stevens had a girlfriend named Brenda Shavir. Everyone targeted in the bombing was related to Brenda. The connection might have been a coincidence, except for one more revealing detail. 3 months earlier, the Monroe County Sheriff's bomb squad told Sammis that a restaurant manager near Rochester found more than 100 sticks of dynamite near a dumpster. The code numbers on the dynamite matched the dynamite in the unexploded bombs. Investigators traced the numbers to the Kentucky Powder Company. The firm, housed in a quarry, sold blasting supplies. Employees gave Sammis a description of a man who had purchased 55 pounds of dynamite and 50 blasting caps 4 months earlier. Sammis's investigation revealed this man to be Earl Figley, a close friend of Mike Stevens. Sammis questioned Figley. Presented with all the evidence implicating him, Figley confessed that he and Stevens made the bombs and sent them to Brenda's family. Figley explained Stevens' motivation. Mike wanted to exact revenge on his girlfriend's family for not accepting him.
The relationship between the two started becoming strained, and Mike started tapping her phone calls. And just as in any relationship, your own family is going to support you in your relationship with another person. And that's what happened in this case. Things weren't going well. Family members of Brenda would tell her, if it's not working out, why don't you get out of the relationship?
Police had enough evidence to arrest both Earl Figley and Mike Stevens, but they still had to build a case that could not be beaten in court. For that, they needed hard evidence to convict Mike Stevens. In New York in 1994, detectives continued to follow every lead as they built their case against a serial bomber. While Mike Stevens and Earl Figley were in jail, the ATF National Response Team searched Figley's hotel room. They found boxes identical to the ones used to send the bombs. A tip led ATF agents and the Rochester Police Bomb Squad to a cache of evidence in a storage locker Stevens had rented several months earlier.
Uh-oh, here we go.
Inside the locker, police uncovered dynamite and blasting caps.
Got it, Madeline?
The explosives provided the ATF and other agencies with the ammunition they needed in their case against Stevens. But the incriminating evidence didn't stop with the explosives.
The disguise that Earl Figley wore.
They also recovered disguises Figley wore when he purchased equipment and mailed the bombs: a wig, beard, and theatrical makeup.
And a beard and a mustache.
They also found the books Stevens and Figley studied to learn how to construct the deadly weapons. The fact that these books exist represents the risk we take living in a free society, according to bomb expert James Crippen.
The information has always been around on how to build devices. That's one of the things that we live with in the United States, because we have a very rigid view of freedom of information, no matter how much trouble it's going to cause us down the road. And I certainly agree with that point of view that, you don't want to restrict information. You just hope that people will use it responsibly.
Besides the explosives and books found in storage, investigators also found tools in Stevens' home. And like most everything else used in a crime, tools can be traced. At the ATF laboratory in Rockville, Maryland, forensic investigators carefully studied wire cutters they found in Stevens' home. Tool mark specialists had to match the wire cutters with the marks they made on the wires found in all the bombs. Tool mark examiner Elizabeth Gillis.
When you have two tools that come off the production line one after the other, they're each going to have their own individuality, their own individual marks, so that when you do make a test cut with the tools, you can put them on the microscope and be able to differentiate between which tool made which mark.
First, Gillis cuts a piece of wire using the cutter she wants to test. The wire is the same type found in the evidence. Investigators must make dozens of cuts with the tool in order to study the angle, contact area, and other attributes of the cut. Only then can they match a wire with the tool that cut it. She places the test cut under a microscope, orienting it to the appropriate angle so that she can compare the test cut with the wire found in evidence. She then superimposes the two images to see if the two cut patterns match. In the case of Mike Stevens, investigators made a successful match. The wires used in all the bombs had been cut by the wire cutters found in the basement of Stevens' house. While the books, wires, and tools helped investigators tighten their grip on Mike Stevens, they still wanted one more piece of evidence. They needed to establish a connection between the explosives and the suspect.
People think that when a bomb goes off and blows up, that everything goes away. There's nothing further from the truth. When you have an explosion, all the explosive material is converted into a gaseous state that actually is consumed in the explosion. Well, that will go out as a heated gas, and when it hits other objects, it will cool down and start coating those objects, such as metal or clothing or wood or whatever. So not only will you have unreacted particles of explosives, but you'll have this gaseous film that's developed on other objects that you can test and get the residues from.
At the ATF lab in Rockville, Maryland, Doug Klapek analyzed residue from the bomb scene to determine the kind of explosive used. Once identified, Klapek tried to match it with evidence collected from Mike Stevens. The residue from explosives evaporates quickly, so samples of the debris were packed in airtight canisters. To test for explosive residue, Klapek had to capture it as it dissipated. He prepared a charcoal-filled pipette, which he then inserted into the top of the canister. The apparatus was then attached to a vacuum. As the canister was gently heated, air was drawn out through the pipette. The charcoal inside the pipette grabbed the chemical components from the evidence. These chemicals were analyzed to see what explosive they came from. The test confirmed that dynamite was the explosive used in these bombs. Next, Klapek had to prove that Stevens and Figley had recently handled dynamite. If they had, its residue would have remained on their clothes.
I found off of Stevens' boots and his clothes ethylene glycol dinitrate, which is only found in dynamite. There's no commercial use other than in dynamite for this material.
Investigators had made their case. They had matched Stevens and Figley to explosives and the tools used to make the bombs. Any missing details were sewn together by Earl Figley himself. With this evidence, ATF agents determined that Mike Stevens constructed 6 bombs in the Rochester hotel room with the help of Earl Figley. In fact, to shift blame from himself, Stevens made sure Figley played a significant role in the murders.
Mike Stevens was using Earl to do all his dirty work for him. And he was successful, I guess, for a few hours anyway, but not for very long.
Stevens' motive was vengeance. He was determined to make Brenda Shavir's family pay for rejecting him. To be certain the bombs were fatal, he loaded each with shrapnel.
There is no doubt in my mind that these devices were designed to kill somebody upon opening. They were a strictly booby-trap device addressed to a specific person.
In order to make the bombs harder to trace, Stevens stuffed the packages with newspapers from Buffalo, so it would appear the packages were sent from there, not from his home in Rochester. In court, Figley implicated Mike Stevens, then pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Convicted of the deaths of 5 people, Stevens was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms. Most times, when a bomb detonates, it begins an agonizing catastrophe. But in a small town in Georgia, explosions are an everyday occurrence. Worldwide, the number of bombings is increasing every year. An alcohol, tobacco, and firearms study revealed that from 1990 to 1994, the number of reported bombings nearly doubled in the United States alone. Pete Maston, head of ATF training, has investigated explosions for more than 30 years.
Well, the typical bomber is perhaps the ultimate coward. The typical bomber doesn't face, nor do they want to face their opponent. They would much prefer to use whatever subterfuge and cover they can.
To make sure these criminals are brought to justice, the ATF brings young investigators and students to this testing ground in Brunswick, Georgia, to teach them how to catch a bomber. Here, the ATF trains evidence technicians, fire investigators, schematic artists, and explosives technicians. At the academy, each skill is refined by repetition. On this day, ATF bomb scene instructors will test their students' knowledge by detonating 3 car bombs, simulating real crime scenes. The men building and packaging these explosives are highly trained experts. Their job is as delicate as it is dangerous. One cannot underestimate the power of the explosive materials. That's why, in inexperienced hands, bomb-making information can be a recipe for disaster, as instructor Larry Casey explains.
All that information that's available doesn't have proper safety precautions in it, and the learning skills of sequential assembly processes, things that are important to know for safety reasons, are totally missing there. So they're always at great risk to blow themselves up. And we oftentimes will get a call and you'll find the tragic aftermath in a garage or someplace where the kids were doing experimentation, and what you get are pieces of bodies and tools scattered around and death and destruction, and that's the sad part of this.
Instructors at the academy begin the training session by building pipe bombs. These bombs are not mock-ups, they are real. The explosive powder must be filled with great care. Just a few grains stuck in the pipe thread could trigger a blast. A small spark or even static electricity could ignite the powder. For the test, the bomb is placed so the end caps shoot into the engine compartment and the back seat, making the work of finding them more of a challenge for the students.
So that big high pressure end cap should go right into that radio area.
So it's fore and aft kind of at this angle?
Yeah.
Okay.
When everyone has cleared the area, it's time for detonation. After the explosion, ATF investigators inspect the wreckage. Some of the lighter fragments were propelled hundreds of feet into the woods, creating a huge area to investigate. These fragments provide the students with valuable clues about the makeup of the bomb and where it was placed inside the car. In the field, nothing can be overlooked. Investigators have only one chance to gather evidence.
Once the scene is released, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible in some cases, to come back into that scene or to recreate that scene hours, days, or weeks later. So it's a one-shot opportunity for perfection.
It quickly becomes evident how destructive these small pipe bombs can be. This explosion was so powerful that part of the cardboard carton pierced the car's steel door.
It's difficult to tell.
Smaller holes.
Other fragments sliced through the roof as if it were foil.
These holes are larger because the pieces didn't fragment as much.
Instructors prepare the next bomb by mixing several low explosives into one powerful cocktail. The work is nerve-wracking. The powder must be tamped into the pipe and the detonator delicately taped to the loaded bomb. In some cases, the seat cushions are wetted down to prevent fire from destroying evidence the students will need to work with. The final package is ready to detonate. After the explosions, the students divide into teams. The team leader assigns each person to a task.
Charlie, Ray, Rick, Frank, Joe. And Colin's going to kind of be the overseer of that group. What you found, if you feel like you found something that's a really critical piece of evidence, it's going to give us particularly the guys that are on the car, to give them an idea on what the device is, to help them look more deeply into certain things. Let's bring that up.
The students work together to investigate the bomb scene. In the field, ATF agents have to work quickly and under a great deal of pressure. Students are taught early on they will have to work with state and local authorities, laboratory technicians, and most importantly, each other to solve a crime. One team begins its work by forming a perimeter around the scene. Then they divide the area into quadrants before they begin their search for fragments.
Hey, Jim?
Just let him.
Colin. Here's your, this looks like the piece of the end cap, right?
The students walk along the tarmac, advancing as a team so they don't miss any shard of evidence. Each piece is then identified with a chalk circle or a small orange cone and assigned a number. In an explosive scene like this, evidence numbers can reach into the thousands. One team member records the identification number and exact location of each piece of evidence. Distances between the fragments are measured to plot their location. Another team closely inspects the damage inside the car. Their job is to figure out which fragments are part of the car and which may be parts of the bomb. For many of the students, this is the first time they have seen a bomb's devastation up close. It won't be their last. And while the damage to the car looks complete, valuable evidence remains embedded in the wreckage. Hatchets, hammers, and crowbars are brought in to pull these clues from the vehicle. The car is literally dissected as students search for pieces of the bomb lodged in or behind the dashboard. They never know where they might find the most significant piece of evidence. The students then move the car and search underneath. Bombs explode in all directions, and clues typically become embedded in the asphalt. Inspectors then sweep up what remains of the scene. The debris is then carefully sifted through a thin wire screen to separate any small clues that may have been overlooked. Instructors intensify the pressure and pump up the realism by adding a chaotic element to the bomb scene. They're called survivors. Role players portray panicked victims and family members whose loved ones have been killed or injured in the blast. The scenarios are built on actual occurrences. The students must learn to be firm but compassionate in the emotionally charged atmosphere. As the actors rush toward the bombed-out car, they're stopped by students who must be able to comfort them and keep them clear of the investigation. Once the scene is cleared, it is photographed and videotaped. Fragments are then collected and sent to a lab. These thorough investigation methods must be learned if the students ever hope to catch a bomber.
You've got to be able to prove your investigation in a court of law. And most of the time, that takes forensic evidence that puts the bomb in the hands of the bomber.
In the classroom, they get an anatomy lesson, learning the vital parts of a bomb. Tape, pipe, detonator, and wires are all carefully examined as the students begin to piece together the evidence gathered outside at the bombing scene. The need for well-trained ATF investigators is crucial for crime solving. Usually, when a bomb goes off, the bomber is miles away. But in a case in Florida, he struck frighteningly close to home. On July 9, 1985, two deafening explosions, seconds apart, rocked a quiet suburban neighborhood in Naples, Florida. The Collier County Sheriff's deputies immediately arrived at the scene. But the explosion had already taken the lives of two people. Matron of the wealthy Benson and Hedges tobacco family, Margaret Benson, and her adopted son Scott were killed. Margaret's daughter, Carol Lynn, was critically injured. The sheriff's office knew this type of devastation was no accident. They called the ATF for help. Special Agent Ralph Ostrowski worked the investigation.
In my 22 years with ATF, particularly my time in Cleveland, when I worked a lot of organized crime, bombings, vehicle bombings, this was without a doubt the worst vehicle bombing I had ever seen.
Ostrowski and his team immediately set out to discover what caused the destruction. Debris from the exploded Chevy Suburban was spread for yards around.
Oftentimes, especially in a bombing of this magnitude, debris can be spread hundreds of feet, well beyond what you think it would be.
ATF agents worked with police to establish a procedure to conduct the evidence gathering. The agents had done this many times before, and they knew this case was going to take a lot of time to solve.
So by the second or third day, needless to say, the scene got to be very, very tedious to work. The agents were forced to wear masks because of the stench, and they did an excellent job in recovering as much of the evidence as they did recover.
Every fragment was marked. Chalk outlined where pieces of debris landed after the explosion. It didn't take long to discover the probable cause of the explosion. They found pieces of large metal pipes that weren't automobile parts. The ATF was confident the vehicle was destroyed by a powerful pipe bomb, but they now had to determine how it was constructed and who planted it.
The vehicle was absolutely destroyed. This was a large vehicle, a 1978 Chevy Suburban. The top of it was peeled back with two 27-pound pipe bombs in a contained vehicle. The force of the explosion did a great deal of damage.
B6.
As the evidence continued to accumulate, agents began questioning witnesses.
Like I said, I went ahead and...
The first person they spoke with was Stephen Benson, the only family member to escape injury.
Escorted them in the car.
His mother and his brother had been killed. His sister was fighting for her life in a hospital, yet police reported that Stephen Benson's demeanor was perfectly calm, even upbeat. This raised the suspicions of Collier County Captain Tom Storer.
My suspicions were aroused immediately that something is not right in what was going on. It just wasn't consistent with a catastrophic event that had just occurred.
Within 24 hours of the explosion, Stephen Benson stopped talking directly with police. All questions filtered through his attorney. Though suspicious about Stephen Benson, investigators had to be careful not to jump to conclusions. So far, they had no solid evidence for or against Benson's involvement. It was too early in the game to launch accusations, and they had no time to waste following a false trail.
Okay, we'll be in touch with you. Okay, thank you.
We follow the evidence wherever that evidence is going to take us. If we focus on one subject and use all of our resources on that one subject and we happen to be wrong, then we've wasted very valuable time early on in the investigation when it's probably one of the most critical periods.
Back at the sheriff's office, investigators began to study all the evidence from the scene, including pieces of electronic circuitry and batteries, elements of a trigger device. They knew that whoever planted the bomb had some expertise in assembling electronics. Ralph Ostrowski and Jack Gant began to study a schematic artist's map of the explosion, giving them a clear look at the epicenter and direction of the blast.
The purpose of these sketches that we're looking at here today is to assist the investigator when he testifies in court. He'll be asked by the defense where each piece of these articles were picked up, and he must be able to testify that he picked these articles up in a location around the car. He must be able to provide testimony of what this article is. He must be able to tell the date and time he got it and identify it later, that this is the item that he picked up the particular day of the crime. Without that testimony, this evidence cannot be used in court.
The schematic shows where every speck of evidence was found after the blast. Their small size and great distance from the car are testament to the tremendous power of the explosion as it tore through the vehicle. Once the maps were drawn and the evidence was collected, the investigation moved north. Fragments gathered at the scene were taken to the ATF laboratory in Atlanta, Georgia. Here, investigators would try to make sense of the twisted wreckage of the vehicle. Forensic chemist Walter Mitchell, a 26-year veteran of the ATF, started with a visual inspection of the fragments. Through the microscope, Mitchell studied the small wafer-like specks clinging to the sample. He tentatively identified the particles as smokeless powder. To confirm he was dealing with smokeless powder, Mitchell had to test it chemically using a process called thin layer chromatography. First, he coated a sheet of glass with an absorbent layer. Then he placed dots of the smokeless powder and his unknown sample on it. The glass was dipped into a tank of solvent. As the solvent was drawn up the absorbent layer, it carried with it small quantities of the dissolved powders. If the powders were the same, they'd migrate the same distance up the glass, forming streaks of identical length and color. Mitchell removed and dried it. Then he put the glass under ultraviolet light to compare the colors of the streaks. In this case, the color of the smokeless powder and the unknown sample matched. A comparison of the lengths of the streaks matched too. The test confirmed Mitchell's suspicions. Smokeless powder was used to blow up the vehicle in Naples, Florida. But scientists in the laboratory could not find any way to link the bomber to the bomb fragments. That evidence would have to come from somewhere else. In Naples, Florida, forensic investigators began to track down the origin of the metal pipe they believed housed the bombs that killed the Bensons. pipe manufacturers stamp a maker's mark on their products. Fortunately, enough of the logo survived the blast to be identified. Agents traced the pipes to the only company in town that sold that brand. A store employee told investigators that a few days earlier he had sold the pipes to a man wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. The buyer said he worked for the Delray Construction Company. Investigators later found out that no such company existed. They took the invoices as evidence. The signatures were nothing more than a scribble, but the paper contained something more revealing. The invoices bore the impressions of a palm print. Could they be the link to the suspect, Stephen Benson? Authorities obtained Benson's own palm prints for comparison. They hoped to find enough points of identification between the two to make a match.
In this case, these palm prints that did come up on these forms are in excellent condition, and the points of identification probably reached near 60 to 75 points of ID. There's no question in anybody's mind that these palm prints are those of Stephen Benson. We have an item we'd like to show you that we...
A background check on Stephen Benson uncovered his fascination with explosives. In a high school yearbook, a dedication he wrote to an old girlfriend read, "I hope to see you this summer, then we can bomb around."
We had developed information that he started experimenting with explosives back many years ago in Pennsylvania. We had talked to witnesses that saw him with firecracker, M80, M100 type of devices, using copper tubing, using remote control to set off some of these firecrackers.
To understand Benson's possible motivation for murder, authorities looked to a financial auditor. The auditor determined that Benson, despite his access to a family fortune, was a terrible businessman. Police discovered that his financial failures were so far-ranging that Stephen started forging checks from his mother's accounts. When Margaret Benson discovered this, she threatened to write Stephen out of her will. Could it be Stephen Benson saw one clear way to get at those millions? Investigators believe Benson used his expertise in electronics to construct the two deadly bombs and the trigger device he used to set them off. On the morning of the bombing, Stephen told everyone he was going to pick up coffee and donuts. But police believe this is when he planted the bombs in the car. Once that was done, all he had to do was trigger the bombs, and a family fortune would be his. Or at least, that's what he planned. After Stephen placed the bombs under the car, he drove back home. He was gone approximately 45 minutes. Carol Lynn, Margaret, Scott, and Stephen set out to drive to the Gulf Coast to survey property for a new house. Carol Lynn reported that Stephen calmly walked side by side with the group, giving no indication of the tragedy he knew he was about to ignite. But as they were all about to get into the car, Carol Lynn noticed something was wrong.
Carol Lynn was able to tell us that the morning they got into the vehicle to leave, that things didn't look right at that point. She noticed that Scott was the driver. That was very rare that Scott was ever the driver. She noticed that Mother was in the front seat. Mother was seldom in the front seat, and that was her place because she got car sick a lot.
According to his plan, Stephen made sure everyone got into the car. Just before they were about to leave, Stephen excused himself to pick up something he'd forgotten. he disappeared inside the house. The investigation into the bombings uncovered the evidence needed to arrest and convict Stephen Benson. He was sentenced to life in prison. Bombs are built from common materials by people with an uncommon thirst for vengeance. Easily concealed, utterly devastating, a bomb can detonate anytime, anywhere. It's this simple truth that makes bombing so challenging to investigators and so chilling for the rest of us. But investigators have the advantage. When a bomber does strike, he always leaves his weapon at the scene of the crime. And with it is the residue of his guilt. A sniper is on the loose on Long Island. His random pattern leaves investigators with only one clue: the ammunition he uses to hunt total strangers. Investigators in Kentucky try to determine the fate of a woman who has disappeared. Her family suspects the worst, but there are no clues, no motive, and no crime scene. In Georgia, a young man is shot to death on a fishing trip. Police find the body of his fiancée 7 miles downstream. But spent bullets are the only clues the killer left behind. In a fraction of a second, a single bullet can shatter many lives. But forensic scientists can decipher clues etched in lead when innocent victims are caught in the line of fire. In this episode, some of the names have been changed to protect the identity of the victims and their families.
How is everything? Everything's fine, thank you.
On July 22nd, 1994, Sharon Chaffetz joined her husband Stephen for a late dinner at a Long Island restaurant. After many years of marriage, they were looking forward to their daughter's wedding, just 2 weeks away. Suddenly, the window near Stephen's head shattered, and he slumped to the floor. The restaurant owner quickly called for help. Suffolk County, New York police and paramedics responded to the call within minutes. But it was too late. Stephen Chaffetz was dead from a single gunshot wound to the chest. No one in the restaurant had seen the shooter. Police processed the crime scene for clues. The trajectory of the bullet suggested that someone had fired a high-powered rifle at the restaurant from an area across the street. No one knew whether the shooting was random or if Chaffetz had been targeted for murder. Lieutenant John Girash of the Suffolk County Police Department led the investigation. He started by looking into the victim's background.
In most homicide investigations, one of the first things that detectives do is to try to learn as much as they can about the victim. Most often, the motive lies within the life of the victim and what's going on with him.
Investigators spoke with the victim's family and friends.
Has he had any contact with any other?
Stephen Chaffetz, a practicing attorney and a CPA, was highly regarded in the community. According to those close to him, he had no enemies. Investigators were perplexed. Why would someone want to kill Stephen Chaffetz? At autopsy, the coroner recovered a .35 caliber bullet, a type most commonly used in high-powered rifles. It was sent to the ballistics lab for further testing. 4 days later, 23-year-old Andy Gomez was working his shift inside the cashier's booth at a nearby gas station. Without warning, a single shot rang out. The booth's window was double insulated and bulletproof. Gomez was lucky to be alive. Within minutes, police secured the area. They found no trace of the shooter. Gomez had little information to offer police. There had been no attempted robbery, and he didn't see anyone prior to the shooting. The bullet, which fragmented upon impact with the bulletproof glass, was all the shooter left behind. Police collected the fragments and sent them to the lab. The MO for both attacks was identical. Police hoped ballistics analysis could tell them more. After noting the similarities between the two shootings, investigators working the Chaffetz murder shifted their focus.
The investigation became more complicated because it was obvious to us that the motive had very little to do, if anything, to do with the two individuals. Rather, these were now appearing to be random acts. And it's those kinds of random acts that make these kinds of investigation most difficult.
The metal fragments from the gas station were sent to the Suffolk County Crime Lab. Although they were too small to compare to the bullet recovered from the body of Stephen Chaffetz, scientists were able to determine their metallic content. A visual inspection under a microscope revealed the bullets shared a common coloration. The fragments from the gas station and the bullet that killed Chaffetz both had copper jackets. It was the first small step in linking the two shootings. But examiners could not say with certainty that the bullets were fired from the same weapon. On August 3rd, a week after the gas station shooting, 42-year-old single mother Kelly Spate was finishing her shift at a local fast food restaurant. A single shot ripped through the window, hitting Kelly. The manager called 911. Suffolk County Police were dispatched to the scene. The victim was badly injured, but still alive. The single bullet passed through her arm and then through her chest, barely missing her vital organs. Police secured the area and interviewed the restaurant's manager. Neither he nor any of the restaurant patrons had seen the shooter. The bullet was found lodged in the wall. Despite the frustrating lack of eyewitnesses in all three cases, the police had an intact bullet for comparison. Forensic specialists examined the evidence at the Suffolk County Crime Lab. The .35 caliber slug was the same size as the bullet that killed Stephen Chaffetz. The two bullets were examined side by side under a high-powered comparison microscope. Each gun has a set of markings inside the barrel called lands and grooves. These markings are etched into the bullet as it travels down the barrel, leaving a series of ridges behind. These ridges are similar to fingerprints in that no two weapons leave identical lands and grooves. When the ridges from both bullets were analyzed, they matched. Lab examiners had finally provided investigators with solid proof that the shootings were related.
They told us unequivocally that that bullet and the murder bullet from the first incident were fired from one and the same weapon. That told us as much as anything else. These were all related cases, and with that, likely at the hands of one individual.
Police had no idea how or when the shooter would strike next. And according to Assistant Chief John McAlone of the Suffolk County Police Department, there were no viable suspects.
We didn't have anyone to really concentrate on, or any even small group to concentrate on. So the major obstacle in this case was identity. Who could it be? Who was it? And how could we stop him? How could we prove a case against him?
As news of the random shooting spread, the community panicked. The press dubbed the unknown assailant the Suffolk Sniper. Investigators feared they were dealing with a madman who shot total strangers for the sheer thrill of the hunt. Suffolk County Police continued their search for an elusive sniper. One man was already dead, and 2 others had narrowly escaped his deadly aim. Investigators were baffled.
There was nothing similar about our victims. This presented almost a nightmare investigatively to detectives because it doesn't give you any direction to start with.
Investigators began by compiling a list of individuals who owned .35 caliber rifles. They also searched police records for recently arrested individuals charged with gun-related crimes. Publishers of various survivalist magazines were asked to send in lists of subscribers from the Long Island area. Police canvassed neighborhoods in the vicinity of the shootings. But residents reported they had not noticed any suspicious activity. Patrol officers set up roadblocks and conducted interviews with thousands of motorists. After several months, investigators had entered over 200,000 names into a database specially modified for the investigation. From these names, Sergeant Edward Light culled 600 strong leads.
We're looking for people that appeared more than once. For example, if they held a hunting license and they subscribed to a survivalist magazine and perhaps were on parole, that would raise a flag to the investigators.
The Suffolk County Police Department mobilized every available resource to find the killer. The massive police presence in the area of the shootings also helped to calm the fearful community.
They visibly saw a lot more patrol cars than they used to. They saw the helicopter overhead more than likely. They saw the canine units all deployed within a certain area, of a narrow area of maybe 9 or 10 miles.
Police were desperate to generate leads. After developing a psychological portrait of the sniper, they appealed to the public for assistance. A detailed analysis of the crime scenes revealed a familiar pattern to investigators. They described the shooter as a white male in his mid-20s to early 30s, probably a gun lover and an avid hunter. The tactics soon paid off. Police received a call from a parole officer. One of his parolees, a man named Peter Sylvester, fit the profile of the shooter. Sylvester had an extensive criminal record, including convictions for the possession of stolen weapons, and he lived close to where the 3 shootings had occurred. Investigators decided to put him under surveillance.
We had come to know that he was on parole, and with his parole were certain conditions that he had to meet. Our surveillance was telling us that he was violating those conditions.
Within a matter of days, Sylvester was observed violating the curfew mandated in his parole. He was arrested and brought in for questioning. At the time of his arrest, Sylvester was in possession of a 9mm handgun. When asked about the sniper incidents, he denied any involvement. Police ran the serial number of the 9mm. They learned the weapon had been reported stolen from a local sports shop. Sylvester was booked for multiple parole violations, including possession of a stolen weapon. Although there was little evidence that he was the sniper, police considered him a prime suspect.
How you doing?
To learn more, investigators tracked down Sylvester's former employer. He told them that Sylvester had left a .410 gauge shotgun in the back of his delivery truck. Police collected the shotgun as evidence.
Those officers I told you about are your speakers.
They also continued to check all gun-related leads. One such lead led detectives to a mental hospital. There, they spoke to a man who had threatened to commit suicide with a high-powered rifle. The patient told investigators that the rifle was a .356 Remington. Although it was not the type of rifle used in the shootings, the patient offered investigators one intriguing piece of information. He told them he had purchased the rifle from a friend, a man named Peter Sylvester. Police ran the serial number on the patient's gun. It had been stolen from a local gun shop 2 weeks before the shootings began. During this robbery, 2 other guns were also taken, a .35 caliber Whelan rifle and a .410 gauge shotgun. The serial number of the stolen shotgun was compared to the one recovered from Sylvester's employer. They matched. The third stolen weapon, the .35 caliber rifle, was consistent with the rifle used to kill Stephen Chaffetz. But that gun was still missing.
And that third weapon, that unaccounted for weapon, fit almost exactly the description of the weapon that we were seeking as the murder weapon.
2 of the 3 stolen guns had been linked to Sylvester. It seemed likely that he was also connected to the missing .35 caliber rifle. Now, investigators needed to prove that the missing rifle was the murder weapon. They visited the manager of the gun shop where the robbery occurred. Sales records indicated the .35 caliber rifle in question had been sold to the shop by a previous owner. Police asked for the address. At this point, investigators had but one hope, that the prior owner still had spent bullets from the rifle in his possession.
Would that be the last one?
If so, those bullets could be compared to the ones recovered from the crime scenes.
Please go ahead and give us a call.
The former owner told investigators that he remembered firing practice shots into a tree during hunting season. But that was a year ago. If he could find that tree, investigators might have the evidence they needed. Suffolk County homicide detective Kevin Cronin was optimistic.
He said he had hunted that mountain for about 20 years. He felt very confident that he could find the tree. His confidence rubbed off on us, and we went up there, myself and our investigative team.
Officers followed the man into the woods. He led them straight to the tree he had once used for target practice. Noting several bullet holes, officers cut the tree down. They sent a cross-section of the trunk to the Suffolk County Crime Lab. In the lab, the sections were cut open. Several bullets were recovered. Examiners could now compare these to the bullets recovered from the body of Stephen Chaffetz. The characteristics of both sets of bullets matched. Investigators had successfully used a missing rifle to link their suspect to the murder. They were slowly building their case against Peter Sylvester. A warrant was obtained to search the house Sylvester lived in with his mother. Officers believed the weapon was somewhere in the house. They checked everywhere. Hidden in the ceiling, police finally found the .35 caliber Whelan rifle. It was now up to the Suffolk County Crime Lab to prove Sylvester was the Suffolk sniper. In the lab, the rifle was fired into a water tank. The bullet was then recovered for comparison with bullets fired by the Suffolk sniper. Under the microscope, ridges on the test bullet matched the ridges on the bullet that killed Stephen Chaffetz. Without a doubt, the .35 caliber Whelan rifle was the weapon used in the shootings. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against him, Sylvester confessed to the shootings. He acknowledged he had never met any of his victims. From a secluded position, he waited for an easy target. He lined them up in his sights and fired. Peter Sylvester was found guilty of murder and received a sentence of 35 years to life. No motive was ever established.
If we weren't able to solve this case for an indefinite period of time, the residents would have to go about with a bunker mentality. They'd have to pull down their shades at night. They'd have to look over their shoulders as they went about their daily routine. We were able to eliminate that circumstance, and Suffolk County, as it was before this incident, remains an extremely safe place to live.
Peter Sylvester did not know his victims. But in Kentucky, murder became a more personal matter. The serene landscape of Dry Ridge, Kentucky, hardly seems the place for a terrible crime. Then again, maybe it's the perfect place. On September 16, 1988, the parents of 28-year-old Paula Doherty reported her missing to the state police. In this rural area, the state police handle most investigations. Paula's parents hadn't heard from her for 2 days. It wasn't like her not to contact them or her children. Paula Doherty, a divorced mother of 2, lived at her parents' house. She had been dating a man named Nathan Marksberry for 6 months and had been spending a lot of time with him. When Nathan heard that Paula was missing, he called the state police to offer his help, though he said he didn't know where she might be. Still, police wanted to meet with him for an interview. They drove to his trailer, located on his parents' farm. He told them that the last time he'd seen her was in the early hours of September 15th, 3 days earlier. They were at a club with some friends. It was closing time, and their friends had left. Marksberry told police that Paula had called someone to come pick her up. He didn't know why, and she wouldn't say. They waited outside.
How you doing?
Eventually, a woman in a yellow or tan car pulled
You
up.
can take care of her, right?
Paula introduced her as Shelley or Sheila. He'd never seen her before. Then they drove off, and Nathan went home by himself. Marksberry said the woman was either a cousin or a friend from Cincinnati. Paula didn't seem upset. It was all very mysterious. Investigators thought so too. Sergeant Ron Harrison learned that it was out of character for Paula to simply up and leave without telling anyone.
Prior to her disappearance, the last family member that she talked to was her mother, who she called from the bar. At her about 10 or 10:30 that night, and didn't indicate to her mother at that time that she was getting ready to call anybody to come and get her. She didn't indicate that she wanted her mother to try to make arrangements to have somebody come and get her or anything of that nature.
Investigators spoke to the other friends who were with Paula that night.
Sergeant Harrison?
Yes.
Each admitted leaving before Paula and Nathan did. And all of them said the evening didn't end on a pleasant note. When they left the bar at closing time, everything was fine. But then in the parking lot, Marksbury grew upset over losing his keys. One of the friends tried to calm him down, and Marksbury hit him. Sergeant Harrison retraced the couple's footsteps, but found nothing in the bar parking lot.
As a result of that altercation, all of these individuals at or about the same time left the parking lot. The only vehicle left on this parking lot after that time was Nathan Marksbury's vehicle, and the only people who were here on this parking lot at that time was Nathan and Paula. And this is the last time that we've been able to establish anyone seen Paula.
Sergeant Harrison could find out nothing else about what happened that night. But witnesses claimed that in the past, they had observed Marksbury being physically abusive with girlfriends. If he had been violent with Paula, she hadn't said a word. State police had only two facts to work with: a dependable woman who disappeared unexpectedly, and her boyfriend, who witnesses said was abusive. Though Nathan Marksbury was now the prime suspect in Paula's disappearance, there wasn't a shred of evidence linking him to any wrongdoing. Investigators' hands were tied. Though it seemed unlikely, it was even possible that Paula had vanished of her own free will. Paula's family wasn't keeping idle. Desperate for answers, they searched for clues on the Marksbury's farm. It caused some problems.
The Marksbury family were talking to me, answering questions, assisting me in any way that they could in attempting to find Paula. And I didn't want that compromised, and they were not happy with the Doherty family being on the property at the same time. As a result, we had to talk to the Doherty family and explain to them that although they had the right to conduct a search, they did not have a right to come onto the Marksbury property.
The investigation into Paula's whereabouts continued, with interviews of Paula's friends and the Marksbury's neighbors. One neighbor said she might have seen Paula with Nathan after the couple left the bar. Nathan had knocked at their door that night. He said he wanted to party with them. It was late, and it was peculiar. They'd never socialized with Nathan before, nor did they want to now.
They refused to party with him. They did not see Paula Doherty with him, but they saw the silhouette of what they took to be a female in the car, but they could not identify that individual because they didn't get out of the car. And then Nathan left their residence, and they never saw him or Paula later that night.
It was just another vague clue, but it indicated that Nathan had not gone home alone that night, as he said he did. Other stories were equally vague and equally compelling. Many neighbors, including a state police officer, had seen Nathan working on the farm after Paula disappeared. He tended a fire at the farm's trash dump for 4 or 5 days. Then he was seen churning the smoldering debris. Neighbors commented that for Nathan to do any sort of physical labor at all was unusual. He was rarely seen working on the farm.
It's just a big open pit.
For investigators, Nathan's actions were suspicious.
His behavior was not consistent with the Nathan that we all had come to know. Nathan would not get out and do something like that just in order to clean up the farm. Couple that with the fact that all of the leads about where Paula might be had wound up with nothing. I was really interested in knowing what Nathan was doing, what he was burying in that dump.
Despite their suspicions, authorities had no basis for a search warrant. They had no legal right to enter the property. Marksbury was free to continue destroying potential evidence. "28-year-old Paula Doherty was missing, presumed dead. Paula's boyfriend, Nathan Marksbury, had been seen burning trash on his parents' farm in the days following her disappearance. Kentucky investigators believed Marksbury was destroying evidence, but their best lead was really no more than a hunch. To test their theory, they needed to check Marksbury's trash pile, but they had no warrant. So they tried the direct approach. They asked his father for permission. To their great relief, he gave his consent to search the grounds, just so long as they didn't disturb anything or enter buildings. Anticipating what they might find, the state police brought with them a forensic anthropologist trained to recognize human remains, even when they're tiny shards. At the dump site, that's just what he found. Fragments of human bones.
At that time, I stopped the search, secured the dump site, and obtained a search warrant.
The warrant allowed the state police forensics team just a few days to search the dump site. Because of the size of the site and the burnt and broken condition of the remains, they needed every minute. Parts were sifted and sorted. Some were large and easy to spot. Others were barely recognizable. Once police had gathered as much as they could find, the remains were sent to the central facility of the Kentucky State Forensics Lab. The lab has the capacity to flesh out a case based on the smallest of clues. It's here that an apparently insignificant fragment can become a crucial piece of evidence. Crimes happen elsewhere, but they're often solved here. The forensic anthropologist must literally put the pieces back together to try to get a picture of the victim's identity and to determine what happened. According to Kentucky State forensic anthropologist Dr. Emily Craig, it requires patience and a little soap and water.
When we first get the bones in the lab, the first thing we have to do is clean them up. And we have to get all the debris and soft tissue off of them. And we really have to resort to a procedure we call thermal maceration, but what it amounts to is dishwashing liquid in a crock pot.
The cleaned bones are then laid out to see if they are from a single individual. It isn't easy. Fire and mishandling take their toll on fragile bones. It takes an expert eye to recognize and understand how they can be distorted.
Part of the problem with burned and fragmented skeletal remains is sometimes a 6-foot individual can be reduced to nothing more than the bones you find here in this box. They change size, they change shape, they change color, they break from the fire, but you can still go through the ashes and find enough bones in most cases to make an identification of the victim and identify the trauma.
Ultimately, the forensics lab had enough to work with. From the pelvis and the size of the bones, it was determined that these were the remains of one female individual. Now they had to prove it was Paula Doherty. To make the identification, the lab relied on the victim's teeth, most of which were recovered from Marksbury's farm. Teeth usually survive even the most intense fires, and they're small enough to avoid being crushed by a killer's mishandling. The records matched the dental remains. Paula Doherty had been found. But finding the body didn't necessarily prove homicide. In fact, once the remains were identified, Nathan Marksbury contacted police to say that Paula shot herself, and he disposed of the body because he felt no one would believe that. Law enforcement didn't believe it, but Sergeant Harrison was afraid a jury might.
You work an investigation not to meet the burden of charging someone. You work an investigation to meet the burden of a conviction that will stand up on appeal. And it was a concern throughout because there was no crime scene per se. There was no physical evidence per se other than Paula's remains.
Marksbury said Paula had shot herself in the head. He gave police the gun she'd allegedly used. There were no fingerprints found. It was impossible for the Kentucky State Police to determine whether she had been the one to fire it. If investigators were going to find grounds for a murder conviction, they would have to rely on the remains alone. The forensics lab began the meticulous process of piecing together the fragments of skull collected from the dump site. It was grossly incomplete, but the important parts were there, revealing not one, but 2 gunshot wounds. They told a lot. Though both shots penetrated the skull, neither was necessarily fatal. The victim might have fired both bullets and bled to death. To test the suicide theory, investigators needed to determine the trajectory of the bullets. Dr. Craig inserted rods into the bullet holes in the victim's skull to ascertain the position of the weapon. She found that Paula could not possibly have positioned the gun to her own head at those angles. Someone else had fired the gun.
Nathan Marksbury, you're being
Police
arrested.
believe that person was Nathan Marksbury. He had the gun. He attempted to destroy the body. Based on the evidence, he was arrested for the murder of Paula Doherty. Nathan Marksbury was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 15 years for tampering with evidence. Investigators theorized that on September 15th, Nathan's anger raged out of control. He murdered Paula, then tried to cover up his crime. Marksbury's violent temper found a target in the person closest to him. Harder to catch is a killer whose rage is unleashed on total strangers. Waycross, Georgia, May 30th, 1993. Ray Hampton and Jean Dixon were worried. Both of their teenagers, 18-year-old Charlie Dixon and 19-year-old Jason Hampton, were missing. The high school sweethearts had gone on a fishing trip the day before and had not returned. It was not like Jason to forget to call. The 2 men drove to their kids' favorite fishing location on the Satilla River. Ray Hampton spotted Jason's truck. Their worst fears quickly became a reality. Ray found the body of his son face down in the dirt. The boy had been shot several times. Jean Dixon's daughter, Charlie, was nowhere to be found. After finding his son murdered on the bank of a Georgia river, Ray Hampton radioed the Ware County Sheriff's Department. His son's young fiancée was still missing. Police cordoned off the entire area and carefully processed the crime scene. They searched for anything that might point to the killer. Jason Hampton had been shot in the back. Several .22 caliber bullet casings were recovered from the ground near his body. Jason's truck was thoroughly dusted for prints, but none were found. His fishing poles were missing. Police also searched the riverbank for evidence. Still, there was no sign of Charlie Dixon. Local police called the Georgia Bureau of Investigation for assistance. Special Agent Bill Butler took the call.
We knew at that time that we had a major case on our hands. We had a young man who had been brutally murdered, and we had another teenage girl who was missing. Certainly there was a great deal of concern on all of our parts to find her and to find the perpetrator.
Investigators split up into teams to search for Charlie Dixon in the wooded areas along the Satilla River. She was nowhere to be found. But investigators refused to give up hope that they would find the young woman. 7 miles upstream from where Jason's body was found, officers made a tragic discovery. They found the nude body of Charlie Dixon. Like her boyfriend, she had been shot several times.
It appears to us in the investigation that the sequence of events that occurred was that after Jason was shot and killed at the scene, that Charlie Dixon was also shot, and she was taken from the scene and was taken to the wooded area in the north part of the county near the Pebble Hill community.
In less than 2 hours, police were processing their second murder scene. The killer had left behind few clues. No shoe prints or tire tracks were found. Looking for valuable evidence, police collected everything they could find at the scene. Charlie Dixon's body was taken to the coroner for further examination. The coroner determined that Charlie Dixon had been sexually assaulted. Investigators hoped they would be able to extract and identify the killer's DNA from the biological evidence collected. The swabs were sent to the Georgia State Crime Lab for analysis. Forensic biologist John Wagle examined the evidence.
When you run the DNA test on the swabs, the first thing you determine is there enough material DNA present to continue with the test? And yes, there was.
The DNA was viable, but police had no suspects to compare it with. They knew they would have to work quickly.
The critical time in any major investigation is the first 7 to 8 hours of the investigation. So that's when you're going to do the most important work that you do in an investigation. That includes the crime scene investigation. It includes your initial interviews with victims' friends and families, and where you're going to find out the most important information in the case that will hopefully lead you to a solution.
Hoping to find a lead, police interviewed the victim's parents.
This river they was found by was anybody.
The Hamptons and the Dixons told investigators that their kids were well liked by their peers and had never been in any trouble. Charlie, a high school senior, was looking forward to graduation. She and Jason, a freshman in college, had just gotten engaged. The parents told investigators that on the morning of May 30th, Jason picked up Charlie to go fishing. They planned to spend the entire day at the Satilla River. That was the last time they were seen alive. The bullets from the double homicide were sent to the GBI ballistics lab for analysis. The lands and grooves on each of the bullets matched. This verified what officers already suspected. Charlie Dixon and Jason Hampton had been shot with the same gun, a .22 caliber Remington rifle. Police had their first solid lead.
As we began to proceed in this investigation, we felt sure that a speedy solution would come about because we had ballistics evidence and we had DNA evidence.
But they still needed a suspect and a weapon to make a comparison. With no obvious motive, the murders seemed to be the random acts of a stranger. Investigators feared that each day this killer roamed free, more people would die.
I know that all of us felt the need to get it solved as quickly as possible before another crime occurred. And when we looked at the brutality of these crimes, we knew that there was a potential there for other people to be victimized.
The Georgia Bureau of Investigation teamed up with area law enforcement agencies. Every department was asked to submit reports of recently investigated violent crimes.
As we conducted our investigation, we began to look at people who had records for similar crimes. And what we looked at was for any suspect who had a record for either sexual assault, kidnapping, or burglary.
Hundreds of potential suspects were interviewed. 60 voluntarily gave DNA samples. The samples were sent to the GBI lab for comparison. None of the DNA samples matched the biological evidence collected from Charlie Dixon's body.
Yes.
The investigation stalled.
So it's been in your possession all week?
Yes. And as time went on, we certainly began to get frustrated because we really developed no suspects that warranted any further investigation into. And certainly we were beginning to doubt whether we would solve this case.
By December of 1993, nearly 7 months had passed since the murders. Agents from the Georgia Bureau of Investigations were no closer to catching the killer. Investigators in Waycross, Georgia struggled to solve the brutal double murder of 2 high school sweethearts. The list of potential suspects climbed to over 1,000. Identifying the killer would take time.
And patience was the name of the game. And we preached it every day in our task force meetings, to be patient, to keep proceeding, to follow every lead, to document everything, and to keep going ahead until we found the perpetrator of these brutal murders.
Their patience paid off. Investigators finally got a break. It came from a local jail. Authorities told agents about a prisoner who was recently placed in custody for violating his parole. The man had threatened to kill his mother and brother with a rifle. His name was Billy Daniel Rawlerson. A background check revealed that Rawlerson was on parole after serving time on a burglary conviction.
Where have you been last week?
Investigators questioned Rawlerson about the murders.
No? You ever been down there?
He denied any knowledge of them.
Would you be willing to take
Before leaving, investigators asked for a blood sample.
All right.
Rawlerson consented. At the GBI crime lab, scientists extracted DNA from Rawlerson's blood sample. The results of the DNA test reveal banding patterns unique to each donor. The banding patterns from Rawlerson's DNA were then compared to those taken from Charlie Dixon's body. Computer analysis statistically confirmed they matched.
No more than 1 in 10 million individuals could have that pattern, and that with a reasonable scientific certainty, the DNA from the biological material on the swab originated from Mr. Rawlerson.
All right, let's search this place.
Police obtained a search warrant for Rawlerson's home. There, they found 2 fishing poles. One was identified as belonging to Jason Hampton. They also found a dismantled rifle, a .22 caliber Remington Model 66. Police hoped it was consistent with the weapon used in the murders. The confiscated rifle was reassembled and sent to the ballistics lab for testing. The rifle was fired into a vertical water tank. The water stops the velocity of the bullet without damaging the projectile, leaving the lands and grooves intact for comparison. Examination confirmed without a doubt that the bullets that killed each of the victims had been fired with this rifle. Faced with this evidence, Rawlerson confessed.
Conclusive proof that you raped and murdered Charlie Dixon.
He told investigators that he stalked Jason and Charlie during their fishing trip. When the couple got into the truck, he shot Jason Hampton. He later raped and murdered Charlie Dixon. On March 5th, 1994, Billy Daniel Rawlerson was sentenced to die in Georgia's electric chair. When a gun is used to commit murder, bullets can provide the strongest evidence of a killer's guilt. Using advances in forensic science, investigators can read clues etched in lead to find justice for innocent victims who have fallen in the line of fire. Police in Northern Oregon are overwhelmed by a string of brutal murders. At first glance, the cases appear unrelated. But as victims continue to surface, the investigation begins to expose a more terrifying truth. A quiet town in Central California becomes the backdrop of a violent double homicide. With no witnesses and little physical evidence, investigators struggle to identify a suspect. To make their case, police must rely on determination, ingenuity, and a little luck. When death comes at the hands of a stranger, investigators depend on the physical evidence to make their case. Forensic science offers the only hope of justice when innocent victims are caught in a killer's deadly aim. Only 16 miles from Portland, the quiet town of Hillsboro, Oregon feels far away from the problems of big city life.
91,482.
But a few hours before dawn on October 9th, 1992, dispatchers from the Hillsboro Police Department received a 911 call. A resident living along Cornell Road reported hearing multiple gunshots. Police arrived at the scene to find an abandoned 1966 Volkswagen Beetle pulled up onto the sidewalk. The car was riddled with bullets. Shattered glass, a purse, and traces of blood littered the front seat. Over a dozen bullet casings were scattered on the ground. In the glove compartment, police found the vehicle's registration. The car belonged to a woman named Martha Bryant. A driver's license found inside the purse also belonged to her. But Martha Bryant was nowhere to be found. As officers tried to piece together what had happened, another call came in from police dispatch.
Yeah, go ahead.
Half a mile away, witnesses reported a woman lying bleeding in the road.
Don't see any exit wound. Check her breathing, respiration.
The officer arrived to find paramedics frantically working to save the woman's life.
right, let's get the
He recognized her from the driver's license photo. It was the owner of the Volkswagen, Martha Bryant. She had been shot twice. The emergency team rushed her to the University Hospital in Portland. But after several hours of fighting for her life, 41-year-old Martha Bryant was pronounced dead. Later that morning, authorities contacted her husband. He couldn't imagine anyone wanting to harm her. He said that Martha was a dedicated midwife at the hospital where she worked.
You want to hold her?
It wasn't unusual for her to be at the hospital well into the morning hours, helping families bring new life into the world. Martha Bryant just didn't seem to have any enemies. At autopsy, the medical examiner noticed signs that Martha Bryant had been sexually assaulted. A single 9mm bullet had pierced her lung. But it was an execution-style shot from a .22 caliber weapon to her right temple that killed her. The slugs were removed and forwarded to the crime lab.
Number 4.
30 degrees.
Criminalists at the Oregon State Police Crime Lab began scouring the Volkswagen for clues.
2 is
Number 1, 20 degrees.
Trajectory analysis showed that Martha Bryant had driven through a hail of bullets.
Number 5, 30 degrees.
Examiners determined that 17 rounds had pierced the car. The attack had come from 2 positions. From the right rear of the vehicle and from just outside the passenger window. It looked like an all-out ambush by someone determined to kill her.
Jacketed 9mm.
Next, examiners compared the bullets collected from the vehicle to those recovered from the victim. They matched. And the markings left on the bullets told investigators that a Browning 9mm handgun had probably fired them. Examiners also confirmed that the fatal shot to the victim's head had been fired from a different weapon, a .22 caliber handgun. This suggested 2 shooters. With no motive and no obvious suspects, Hillsborough police believed this would be a difficult case to solve. Detective Michael O'Connell of the nearby Washington County Sheriff's Department was asked to assist in the investigation.
It was extremely unusual, the extreme violent nature of it, the senseless, random nature of it. It was unlike anything that we had or unlike anything that had happened even in the whole Portland metropolitan area.
News of Martha Bryant's murder sent shockwaves through the community. The public came forward with dozens of tips, but they all led nowhere. 2 months after the shooting, the Martha Bryant investigation ground to a halt. But Detective O'Connell refused to let this senseless murder go unsolved. Believing that Martha Bryant had been randomly targeted, O'Connell began reviewing another cold case he was working from a year earlier. That victim also seemed to have been targeted by a stranger. He began looking for signs that the 2 cases may be connected. On April 19, 1991, Washington County investigators were dispatched to the home of an elderly Hillsborough resident. There, they discovered 62-year-old Margaret Schmidt.
You can get in that angle there.
She had been sexually assaulted, strangled, and then suffocated with a pillow. The only piece of evidence recovered from the scene was a man's size 8.5 Reebok sneaker print left in some spilt talcum powder. The subsequent investigation into Margaret Schmidt's murder had uncovered no solid suspects.
Margaret Schmidt had no enemies, led a very quiet lifestyle. There were no actual witnesses that night to this person sneaking into her house. Other than the shoe prints, we had nothing else to go on.
After reviewing the case file, O'Connell could find no similarities between the two murders. The MO in each was radically different. The only thing that Martha Bryant and Margaret Schmidt shared in common was that both appeared to be unlikely victims. Still, investigators at the Washington County Sheriff's Department needed to find a way to close these two investigations. And their caseload was about to increase. Two months after Martha Bryant's murder, a passing truck driver spotted something on the side of the road. As he got closer, he realized he had found the lifeless body of a young woman. He immediately called the Washington County Sheriff's Department. Detective Scott Ryan received the call.
The information that we had at that point was not specific. The people on the scene did not know if it was the victim of a hit and run or if the body had been dumped for some other reason.
When officers arrived at the scene, they found that the victim had been shot at point-blank range from underneath her chin by a .22 caliber pistol. She had also been badly beaten and sexually assaulted. But other than the bullet used to kill her, no physical evidence was recovered. Investigators had no idea who this woman was or why she had been murdered. Hoping to identify her, the victim's fingerprints were run through the police database. They got a hit. Records indicated this victim had been charged on a minor violation a few years earlier. She was identified as 23-year-old Shantee Woodman of Portland, Oregon. Detectives interviewed Woodman's friends, but no one had any useful information. She was known as a free spirit, and everyone police spoke with liked her. Like the Margaret Schmidt and Martha Bryant investigations, the murder of Shantee Woodman quickly threatened to go cold. To keep the number of unsolved murders from growing higher, Washington County authorities organized a task force comprised of officers from area law enforcement agencies. The difference in the ages of the victims and the different MO in each murder led the team to conclude these cases were unrelated. And though a .22 caliber handgun had been used in two of the murders, examiners at the lab concluded they were different weapons. For the next several months, police followed hundreds of leads in each of the three unsolved cases. But despite their efforts, little progress was made. And then, new reports of violence began to pour in. The normally quiet community of Hillsborough seemed to be caught up in a deadly crime wave. As police in Hillsboro, Oregon struggled to keep pace with the growing number of unsolved homicides in their community, a new rash of assaults were being reported. Investigators learned that 2 elderly women had been attacked in separate incidents. Police spoke with one of the victims, who was still recovering in the hospital. She said a man came to her door asking to use a phone. Once inside, he attacked her. But the woman managed to activate an alarm pendant. The assailant panicked and fled. The woman was certain that her attacker was a man who used to live in her apartment building. 30-year-old Cesar Baroni. The second victim was also able to identify Baroni as her assailant. A warrant was issued for his arrest. Investigators quickly tracked Baroni to a local bar. He was placed under arrest for the 2 assaults.
Stand up, please. Put your hands on the bar.
Unlike the unsolved murders of Margaret Schmidt, Martha Bryant, and Shanti Woodman, it seemed the latest rash of violence would be quickly resolved. At the weekly task force meeting, Detective O'Connell learned about Baroni and details of the recent assaults. Baroni had an extensive felony record, which included a number of assaults and rapes on elderly women. As he continued listening, Detective O'Connell realized that the MO of the recent assaults bore striking similarities to one of the unsolved murders, that of 62-year-old Margaret Schmidt.
Right away, we're speculating, could he be responsible, at the very least, for the murder of Margaret Schmidt, because of the age of these victims that survived and the fact that the one victim lived only a block away from Margaret Schmidt.
How you doing?
Though it was only a hunch that the cases may be connected, detectives interviewed Baroni in jail. He claimed he had never heard of Margaret Schmidt and denied any involvement in the recent assaults on the elderly women. Having been positively identified, investigators were convinced that Baroni was lying.
Glock 37.
Looking for any useful information, they asked him if he owned any weapons.
I've got an AK-47.
To their surprise, he admitted to owning several.
I've got
one, he said, was a Browning 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Investigators had been searching for the same type of gun in connection with the shooting death of 41-year-old midwife Martha Bryant. The hunch that Baroni was connected to the murder of Margaret Schmidt had uncovered a possible link to another unsolved case. Looking for evidence that could tie Baroni to the 2 murders, police obtained a warrant to search the house he shared with a roommate.
Showed up about the same time as the night.
The man led them to Baroni's Browning 9mm semi-automatic pistol.
Let's go ahead and take this one.
We sent that gun in to be test fired and compared to the Martha Bryant ballistics evidence. But at that time, it was only a hunch. There was nothing that directly led us to believe that he killed Martha Bryant.
Police continued searching for evidence that could tie Baroni to the unsolved murders. In his bedroom, they found another potentially vital clue. A pair of Reebok tennis shoes, the same type of shoe that had left the print at the Margaret Schmidt crime scene. At the crime lab, examiners analyzed the shoes recovered from Baroni's house. They were determined to be Reebok ERS tennis shoes, size 8.5. Examiners overlaid Baroni's shoes onto transparencies of the print lifted from Margaret Schmidt's house. The unique characteristics present on the treads of Baroni's shoes were identical to those found at the crime scene. Examiners concluded that Baroni's shoe had left the print. Speculating that they had inadvertently exposed a serial killer, investigators turned to the gun recovered from Baroni's house, the one suspected in the shooting of Martha Bryant. Criminalist Chris Johnson fired the Browning 9mm weapon into a water recovery tank. Under a comparison microscope, the samples were compared to the 9mm bullets recovered from Martha Bryant's lung and from her Volkswagen. Detective O'Connell was contacted and given the results of the analysis.
Chris Johnson test-fired that Browning 9mm pistol and determined that that gun and that gun alone had fired those bullets removed from her Volkswagen and had ejected those casings found along Cornell Road, to the exclusion of any other gun in the universe. It was an absolute, solid, positive match.
Though it was powerful evidence, it didn't prove that Baroni fired the fatal shot,
Let's check out the other side.
which had come from a different weapon, a .22 caliber pistol. As police searched for that gun, they got a break. An inmate locked up with Baroni came forward.
I'm sick of this guy.
The inmate said Baroni had been bragging about the murder of Martha Bryant.
You know, the weapons he used.
Baroni told the inmate that he was the lone gunman.
You know how he shot the woman.
He had used the 9mm to shoot up the victim's Volkswagen and then the .22 to deliver the fatal blow.
This guy's crazy. You know, like he's the baddest criminal.
And that wasn't all. Baroni had bragged that he and another man had committed yet another murder several months before that had remained unsolved. The details of that homicide also sounded familiar to investigators. Detective Scott Ryan reviewed the inmate's statements.
One of the cases that Mr. Baroni had described to the inmate was a case of a female who was picked up in Portland, transported out west, and raped and murdered. There was only one case that could be consistent with, and that was the death of Shanti Elise Woodman.
The investigations into 3 seemingly unrelated homicides were converging, exposing a trail of murder that led to one serial killer. Now, police needed to find hard evidence to make sure that Cesar Baroni would never be free to kill again. Having conclusively tied suspected serial killer Cesar Baroni to the unsolved murder of Margaret Schmidt, police in Hillsboro, Oregon now sought to link him to the murders of 41-year-old Martha Bryant and 23-year-old Shanti Woodman. Baroni's alleged accomplice in the Woodman murder was tracked down to a local jail where he was serving time on an unrelated charge.
Perhaps you might be able to tell me what your...
At first, Leonard Darcell was uncooperative. But after being confronted with the inmate's testimony, he decided to talk. Darcell told the detectives that he and Baroni had met Shanti Woodman in a Portland bar the night she was killed. They conned her into Baroni's car. Once inside, Baroni beat and raped her. Then they drove her to a remote location. Darcel told police he begged Baroni to just leave her alive by the highway.
Get down, get out.
But Baroni shot her anyway, using a .22 caliber pistol.
But he laughed at that.
Though police were getting close to making their case, they needed to find the weapons used in the Martha Bryant and Shanti Woodman murders. In the course of interviews with Baroni's acquaintances, the police learned that he had scattered guns all over town, leaving many with ex-girlfriends. Police tracked down and collected several of these weapons, including a number of .22 caliber pistols. The weapons were forwarded to Chris Johnson at the Oregon State Police Crime Lab. Before the test firing, however, Johnson decided to first swab the barrel of one of the weapons that was consistent with the gun used to kill Martha Bryant.
We knew that the head wound to Martha Bryant was a contact near contact, and that with a gunshot wound you can get high velocity blood spatter. We swabbed the outside of the barrel and the inside of the barrel first before we test fired it to check for back spatter. We were able to find blood inside the barrel.
DNA testing showed the blood on the inside of the gun barrel was consistent with blood recovered at autopsy from murder victim Martha Bryant. This was the link needed to prove that Baroni's gun delivered the fatal head wound. Examiners at the crime lab were also able to conclusively tie another of Baroni's .22 caliber guns to the murder of Shanti Woodman. In all, Oregon authorities had linked serial killer Cesar Baroni to 3 unsolved murders.
Detail on the firing pin.
Oh, yeah. 18.
Detectives marched into the Washington County Jail and charged Cesar Baroni with the murders of Margaret Schmidt, Martha Bryant, and Shanti Woodman, and also with the assaults on the 2 elderly women. Based on the evidence, police believe that Baroni constantly prowled the area, searching for vulnerable women to abduct, molest, and kill. Though he targeted elderly women, anyone who crossed his path was a potential victim.
Not only had he gone after so many elderly people that should have had some type of peace in their later years, but he'd performed some very terrifying attacks on some people that were just totally unsuspecting as to what a predator he really was.
Cesar Baroni stood trial for the murders of Martha Bryant, Shanti Woodman, and Margaret Schmidt. In all 3 trials, he was sentenced to death. For his involvement in the Shanti Woodman kidnapping and murder, Leonard Darcel was sentenced to 20 years without the possibility of parole. Serial killer Cesar Baroni waited until his victims were alone before attacking. Other killers strike whenever the opportunity presents itself. Atascadero is known as a small, peaceful town nestled in the foothills of California's beautiful central coast. But a handgun will shatter the tranquility of any town, and Atascadero is no exception.
Shots fired, 8700 block.
In the early morning hours of February 5th, 1987, police and paramedics were dispatched to an apartment complex. There, they discovered the body of a young woman lying on the sidewalk. She had a single gunshot wound to the left temple. The emergency team also removed a nylon stocking that had been used to gag the victim. As crime techs fanned out to search the area for evidence, police began interviewing residents at the complex. They identified the woman as their neighbor, 22-year-old Lori Rainwater. They said that they had rushed outside after hearing screams followed by several gunshots. But because of the fog, they couldn't see anything clearly. They had no idea who could have done this. As the search for clues continued, police discovered another victim at the rear of the building. He was dead, the victim of a gunshot wound to the chest and an execution-style shot to the back of the head. He had also been gagged with a stocking. Neighbors later identified him as Lori's husband, 25-year-old John Rainwater. Police made their way to the couple's apartment. There, they discovered that the bedroom was on fire. This killer had gone to great lengths to obliterate any trace of himself from the crime scene. Police in Atascadero, California, continued searching for clues in the double homicide of John and Lori Rainwater. After extinguishing a fire that had been deliberately set inside the couple's apartment, police began processing the scene. Blood spatter found throughout the apartment suggested a vicious attack. No fingerprints were discovered. Police did find evidence that the murdered couple had been bound. Yards of duct tape used to bind them were recovered. They also found 2 makeshift mittens made from socks wrapped with duct tape, probably used to keep the victims from loosening their bonds. As the search continued, police noticed 2 empty jars on a table. All of the items were collected and sent to the crime lab for a closer examination. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that each of the victims had suffered deep, blunt force lacerations. There were also signs that they had been sexually assaulted. But it was a .38 caliber gunshot wound to the head that killed both John and Lori Rainwater. The recovered slugs were forwarded to the California Department of Criminal Justice Crime Lab. As examiners started processing the evidence, investigator Bill Hanley of the San Luis Obispo County DA's office began looking for leads. With no eyewitnesses to the double homicide, there were no immediate suspects to pursue.
The homicide occurred at approximately 6 a.m. It was a very foggy, dark morning, which hindered eyewitness' ability to see anything clearly.
With little evidence to go on, investigators turned to the victims' families for information. Mrs. Martinez, Lori Rainwater's mother, could not imagine anyone that would want the couple dead. She said that John and Lori were a happy and deeply religious couple. They worked several jobs, one of which included taking care of the apartment building for their landlords. They carefully budgeted their money. In fact, they had recently saved enough to move to a bigger apartment in order to raise a family. Mrs. Martinez said Lori had stored their savings in small glass jars. Investigators realized that those jars had been found empty. The information led investigators to theorize that robbery was the motive behind these savage murders. They hoped the evidence could tell them more. The duct tape and the empty jars believed to have contained the rainwater savings were analyzed by latent print examiner Marty Collins. An inspection of the jars, however, revealed no signs of fingerprints. Next, Collins turned to the duct tape. But the tape was stuck together and crushed.
Once you get the tape that is stuck together, although there are ways to try and take it apart, the chance of getting latent prints is greatly diminished.
Traditional methods of locating and raising a print were unsuccessful. But Collins had one technique left to try: a dye staining process. After applying the chemical rhodamine 6G to the tape, a laser light was applied to the evidence. The dye adheres to any latent prints present on the tape. Under the light, a small section of a fingerprint emerged. But the discovery was not that encouraging. Collins realized that this evidence could not be compared to prints already on file. The print from the tape was from high up on the tip of the finger, not on the pad of the finger where inked prints of suspects are taken. Over the next few months, police developed several suspects. They were all brought in for questioning, but eventually fingerprint analysis eliminated all of them. For Detective Hanley, it seemed that the investigation into the deaths of John and Lori Rainwater was at a standstill.
Due to the high publicity of the case, for approximately the next 2.5 months on a daily basis, up to 16, 17 hours a day, we ran down leads. These leads were from different parolees or offenders in the area to people calling up and saying that they believe that their neighbor did it, although having no really proof on it. All the leads that we had run into came up to be dead ends.
But then, on April 29, 1987, 2 months after the murders, police received a phone call from a woman who claimed to have information about the Rainwater homicides. She agreed to come in and answer questions. The informant said that she had met the Rainwaters a few days before they were murdered. While looking for an apartment, she and her boyfriend, Dennis Dwayne Webb, had spoken with them. The Rainwaters explained that they only collected rent money from the tenants for the landlord. They didn't actually rent out apartments. But while in the apartment, the informant noticed that her boyfriend was constantly glancing at the money jars on the kitchen counter. For investigators, the story hardly proved murder. But there was more. She went on to say that a week or so after meeting with the Rainwaters, she and Dennis Dwayne Webb were arrested in a drug raid. Police had collected drugs and several weapons, but failed to find a hidden .38 caliber pistol. Having followed the double murder investigation in the media, the informant knew that was the same type of gun used to kill John and Lori Rainwater. The informant was released on bail the following day. Shortly thereafter, Webb called her from jail. He wanted to talk about the hidden .38 caliber handgun.
She advised me that, at Dennis Webb's insistence, that she was to dismantle the gun, take it to the coastal area in California, and throw it off the cliff into the ocean.
The informant did as she was told. After taking the gun apart, she drove to a remote area along the coast and threw the gun over a 300-foot cliff. After months of having no solid leads, police now considered Dennis Dwayne Webb as the prime suspect in the murders of John and Lori Rainwater. But to make their case, they needed to locate the murder weapon. And after viewing the area, investigators were not optimistic.
Frankly, when I went there and noticed where she did throw it off, I thought there was little or no chance of ever recovering that weapon again.
Members of the search and rescue team from the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Department were brought out to the site. After surveying the area, the team meticulously mapped out their mission. They double-checked all of their equipment to ensure their safety, and then geared up. It was now up to them to rappel down the perilous cliff and search the beach below for the weapon believed to have been used to kill John and Lori Rainwater. As investigators in Atascadero, California, continued searching for evidence in the slayings of John and Lori Rainwater, they finally got a break. An informant admitted that at the instruction of her boyfriend, Dennis Dwayne Webb, she had thrown the murder weapon off a 300-foot cliff into the Pacific Ocean. Though finding the weapon seemed like a long shot, the search and rescue team slowly made their way down the sheer cliff. Because of the treacherous conditions, it took the two-man team nearly 3 hours to reach the bottom. Once there, they began searching for the gun. For over an hour, the search turned up nothing. But then, under some rubbish, they found what appeared to be the frame of a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. Though it was badly damaged, police believed they had found the murder weapon. The team made their way back up the cliff and turned the gun over to investigator Hanley. For him, its value as evidence was questionable.
Looking down the barrel of this weapon, this was covered completely in rust. Frankly, I didn't think we were going to be able to get any type of ballistic help at all from this.
Police sent the gun to the California Department of Justice Crime Lab. Technicians managed to reassemble and clean the gun enough to test fire it. The test-fired bullets were then compared to those recovered from John and Lori Rainwater. The markings left on the bullets as they traveled down the barrel of the gun matched in some areas, but not all. Investigators were building a good case, but they were still a long way from proving murder. Police turned to their informant for help. They wanted to try and coax Webb into a confession. They asked his girlfriend to wear a wire and record conversations with him in prison. She agreed to cooperate, despite the danger of being exposed.
I'm convinced that the informant's motivation was only to see that justice was done. At no time during the investigation did the informant ask for any leniency on any pending criminal case she had, nor did she ask for any type of reward that was out there. It was only to see that justice was done.
During their conversations, Webb made no overt references to the murders. He believed that the correctional facility recorded all conversations. But when the informant told him she was worried that police suspected him in the murders, he began talking. But he spoke in code. Police were able to break it.
For instance, when he referred to the weapon that was recovered off the coastline, he referred to that as a cat. When he would talk about killing somebody, he would talk about popping grapes. It was that kind of code that we had to decipher.
Webb assured the informant not to worry. In addition to discarding the murder weapon, he said he had made certain that none of his prints had been left behind. Though Webb's statements were incriminating, they fell short of a confession. But they were enough for investigators to obtain a warrant to search Webb's car. Underneath the driver's seat, investigators found a roll of the same type of duct tape found in the Rainwater's apartment. In the trunk, they found a receipt for the tape, stamped with the date and time, February 4th, 1987, at 8:37 p.m. The purchase of the duct tape had been made just hours before the Rainwaters were murdered. Though convinced that Webb was the killer, police still needed to physically link him to the crime scene. Because the print on the duct tape found at the scene was from high up on the finger, examiners were unable to match it to any of Webb's fingerprints already on file. But investigators were able to obtain a court order to get new prints, this time from the area high up on Webb's fingertips. Marty Collins of the Department of Justice Crime Lab performed the analysis.
With the use of a 5-power magnifying glass, I compared the photograph that I had taken of the print on the tape with the inked fingerprints of Dennis Webb, and until I found the finger that was identified, and I found a sufficient number of ridge characteristics to make the identification.
The analysis proved that Dennis Dwayne Webb had bound the victims with the duct tape. The information was enough for investigators to charge him with 2 counts of capital murder.
Investigator Hanley.
Police theorized that after seeing the money in the Rainwater's apartment, Dennis Dwayne Webb began plotting to take it from them. A few days after that chance encounter, he returned to the couple's apartment and forced his way inside. Not only did he steal their savings, he also terrorized and tortured them for hours. When the couple managed to somehow escape, Webb chased them down and murdered them in cold blood. He then set the place on fire, hoping to destroy any evidence he may have left behind. On June 20th, 1988, Dennis Dwayne Webb was convicted of burglary, robbery, and 2 counts of murder with special circumstances. During the penalty phase of the trial, Webb testified, and for the first time admitted his responsibility for the deaths of John and Lori Rainwater. After hearing his admission of guilt, the jury sentenced Dennis Dwayne Webb to death. Stranger-on-stranger homicides are among the hardest to solve. But fortunately for investigators, killers always leave clues behind. They rely on forensic experts in the lab to help them solve the crimes and bring about justice when killers take deadly aim.